Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with a brief mention of Marion Barry, who died recently at the age of 78. Marion Barry was the four-time mayor of Washington, D.C. In between his terms as mayor in the 90s, he was arrested and a well-publicized cocaine sting, went to prison for a little while. And I'm not going to soft-pedal Marion Barry. There's no middle ground with Marion Barry. You either loved him or you hate him. To the people of Washington, D.C., many of them consider him the mayor for life. To a lot of other people around the country, they consider him sort of a sleazy guy. And, you have to draw your own conclusions on Marion Barry. He was born in Mississippi in the Delta. He was born in Itta-Bena. And your trivia answer for the day is the other famous person born in Itta-Bena was B.B. King. As a young man, he was prominent in the civil rights movement in the early 60s. He came to Washington, D.C. in 1965 as part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And eventually he worked his way up through the Washington, D.C. politics and became the second mayor of D.C. Here is Washington, D.C. TV on Marion Barry.
Our top story this morning, that news overnight of the death of former D.C. Mayor Marion Barry. Chanel is following that one for us. Chanel, good morning. Despite never holding national office, Barry was a national figure after a very high-profile arrest nearly 25 years ago. Marion Barry was one of the most charismatic politicians in our nation's history.
This would be a government which is both competent and compassionate.
So popular, one D.C. newspaper called him Mayor for Life. But despite his accomplishments, he may be remembered most for the night he was arrested in a downtown Washington hotel room smoking a crack pipe with a woman who was not his wife. He said he'd been set up, but despite sending 6 months in federal prison, Barry returned to politics. He was elected to city council and later as mayor one more time. Local residents loved him, seeing him as a champion for the poor. But controversy was never far away. In 2006, Barry received probation for failing to file tax returns. He was also censured for steering a government contract to a girlfriend. In recent years, he suffered from numerous health problems. Marion Barry remained a beloved figure to the end in Washington, D.C. This morning, the current mayor calling him a true statesman.
Yeah, I think the most we can say about Marion Barry is he had undeniable political skills, but he probably frittered away some of his talent. We're going to move on now to our feature, Viktor Tikhonov, who died recently at the age of 84. And if he wasn't the greatest hockey coach in history, he was certainly in the class photo. If you're a young American or Canadian hockey fan, you may not know him because he never coached in the United States or Canada. He was the coach of the Soviet Red Army team, the world's dominant hockey team in the 70s and 80s. Here's a very brief description from British television of the Soviet Red Army team and Viktor Tikhonov.
Once upon a time, the Soviet Union was the greatest, unbeatable. 5 men were the heroes of a nation. To create the perfect sports machine, the Soviet Union drafted its best hockey players into the military. Since the country had compulsory military service, the Red Army Club could more or less force young players to join. They became hockey soldiers. The Soviet Union also raised Viktor Tikhonov. He's a product of the whole post-war era. A survivor who knows what is expected of him. Victories. Second places are losses that might cost the nation prestige and himself the job.
Tikhonov originally had a soccer background after World War II. Then he got into hockey. He was a fairly successful hockey player. He became the coach of the Red Army team, succeeding Anatoly Tarasov, who was also a legendary Soviet hockey coach. Tikhonov brought a lot of his strategies from soccer with him. He was a brilliant tactician. He was the first one to use 4 lines. His methods were dictatorial. Remember, this was an army team, and they didn't mess around in the Soviet Union. There were stringent practices, stringent discipline. His players lived in these Spartan barracks. He was out in front of the bench when there were games going on. He didn't mess around behind the bench. He was a no-nonsense guy. But his methods paid off. His team revolutionized hockey with their speed, their passing, and their movement. They won 12 straight Soviet titles. They were clearly the best team in the Soviet Union. Of course, if you had the Red Army behind you, you'd probably be a pretty good team. They won 8 world championships in the 70s and 80s, 3 gold medals in 1984, 88, and 92, the 1979 Challenge Cup where they beat the NHL All-Stars, and the 1981 Canada Cup. He coached some of the greatest Soviet players ever, including Valery Kharlamov, Slava Fedosov, Sergei Fedorov, Igor Larionov, and Pavel Bure. So Viktor Tikhonov has quite a resume, but for all that, he's most famous for the game he lost. In the heat of the moment, even the greatest coaches can screw up. In 1980, Tikhonov was the losing coach in probably the most famous game in hockey history.
11 seconds. You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. Morrow up to Schultz. 5 seconds left in the game. You believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
And of course was the famous Miracle on Ice, the 1980 Olympic hockey game between the United States and the Soviet Red Army team in Lake Placid that led to the United States winning the gold medal. There was no question that the Soviet Red Army team was the superior team. They dominated some of the NHL players, and the American team was primarily a bunch of college kids. It was one of the great upsets in sports history, and Tikhonov made a fateful decision during the game that contributed to it. At the end of the first period, the Soviets were winning 2-1. With 1 second left when this occurred.
Out at the point, 19 seconds. It's blocked in front. Kristov can't get his stick on it. And the Soviets able to clear it to the side. 12 seconds remaining in the period. The scoring, it's been changed. They've given the goal, as we saw in the replay, to Krutov for the Soviet Union. That made it 1-0. Long shot, the easy save by Tretiak, but Johnson is there and scores with 1 second to play in the period. Right now, the clock shows nothing, but it was stopped at 1 when we looked up as the goal was scored. Right now, it shows nothing as the period apparently has come to an end. But the United States has tied the game. A big, big goal for the U.S. team. Ken Morrow took a shot from the other side of center ice. It's Dave Christian, knowing that there was almost no time on the clock. But the rebound comes right out to Mark Johnson, who goes wide of Tretiak to tie it up. Very careless rebound, an uncharacteristically careless rebound by Tretiak.
Well, Tretiak that you heard there was Vladislav Tretiak, and many people consider him the greatest goalie in hockey history. But with 1 second left in the first period, he let a rebound by him. Tretiak had dominated the opposition at every level of competition. He was absolutely amazing. But when the second period opened, Tikhonov made a fateful decision. You'll hear the announcer call it courageous, but that's just announcer talk. It was really stupid.
Change for the Soviet Union as Vladimir Mushkin becomes the new goalie after Tretiak had given up 2 in the first period.
Tretiak had a very shaky first period. Mushkin has a little bit of international experience. There's Tretiak on the bench, a very uncharacteristic place for him. Mushkin played well last year in the final game of the Challenge Cup Series, shutting out the NHL All-Stars 6-0. Since that time, in games against North American teams, in particular NHL games, he's done very poorly this year. And so it was it's a very courageous decision, really, by Coach Viktor Tikhonov. It's really a reflection on the problems that Tretiak has been having.
Hey, you pull the greatest goalie in the world in a tie game. That's for the Olympic gold medal. And you're asking for trouble, and that's exactly what happened. Everybody realized later what a mistake it was when Michigan let in 2 goals. Tikhonov never commented on it. I read Tretiak's book, and to his credit, he never criticized Tikhonov for it, even though he mentioned what a bad mistake it was. Besides being a great goalie, Tretiak was also a very classy guy. It was probably a matter of overconfidence. Tikhonov probably thought he could win with his second-string goalie in there. But for all success, Tikhonov never lived that decision down. We're going to move on now to P.D. James, who died recently at the age of 94. She was a British crime novelist, one of the great female detective writers of our generation. Unlike much crime fiction, her work was true literature, especially with a lot of character development. It wasn't just boilerplate plots. Here's Matthew Bannister, the BBC4 Last Word on P.D. James.
Now, when you first met the crime novelist P.D. James, or Baroness James of Holland Park, she struck you as everybody's favourite grandmother. But behind that grandmotherly exterior lay a keen intelligence, a sharp wit, and an unhealthy interest in murder. She was a civil servant until she was 60 and started her writing career while still working in hospital administration. Her first book, Cover Her Face, was published in 1962, introducing her master detective and poet, Adam Dalgleish, to the world.
To Cambridge Girls' High School, and the English mistress's name was very important.
It was Miss Maisie Dalgleish, yes.
Is that where you took it from,
yes,
for Adam Dalgleish?
Indeed, I did. And what was so extraordinary was that I met her many, many years later, and she told me her father had been called Adam. That was a rather strange coincidence, wasn't it?
Some can gaze and not be sick, but I could never learn the trick. There's this to say for blood and breath: they give a man a taste for death.
The moment in a detective novel when the body is discovered is one of very great drama. It's often one of tremendous horror to the person making the discovery, and you want to convey that horror to the reader.
The shocking news of Paul's death brought back to me the moment I first heard that Hugo had been killed in Northern Ireland. So to my present grief was added a grief for Hugo, as keen, as new as when I'd first heard of his death.
It's terribly important to start with someone who isn't too bizarre and eccentric, like Poirot, otherwise you're lumbered with him. Someone who can develop, and someone you personally like. Because if the writer gets bored with her character, the readers are certainly going to be very bored.
But there's a ruthless streak there as well, isn't there?
He has that splinter of ice in his heart, yes, indeed.
And you've
he
been
does.
quite ruthless with him because you killed off his wife in childbirth.
Yes, I did.
Why doesn't he need all those
I didn't want to cope with his love life, you see, so I was ruthless in killing off his wife and his newborn child. But in the last book, Death in Holy Orders, you see, he falls in love.
Here she tells an interviewer from the Telegraph how she got into detective writing and about the craft of writing itself.
Well, I loved detective writing in my adolescence, and when I began, I thought, if I can do it, it's a popular form, it will stand a good chance of being accepted, but I also thought it would be a wonderful apprenticeship for someone setting out with quite high ideals. I wanted to be a good and serious novelist, and this is quite a difficult form to do well. So I thought it would be a wonderful apprenticeship, and as I continued in the craft, I came to believe what I believe now, that you can stay within the conventions and the constraints and the structure of the classical detective story and be a good and serious novelist and say something true about men and women and the society in which they live. Well, I think many of them are inborn, but I think you have to have a huge sensitivity to words. And you have to know good writing from bad. You have to just recognize it instinctively in yourself and in others. You have to have a continual interest in life, in people, in their motives, and sympathy for them, and empathy for life. You have to live very keenly with all your emotions. And I think you have to be pretty disciplined. I like to write by hands. My secretary has a computer, but no machine made by man is user-friendly to me. So I love writing by hand, and I do it by biro on old foolscap. And then when my secretary comes in, I write early in the morning, I dictate to her, she puts it on the computer, and then she prints it out, and I revise as I go. And I find that's a very satisfactory form of writing. So at the end, it's all got to be put absolutely in order. And then there's great read-through and a final revision. But on the whole, I try to make it as perfect as possible as I go.
Well, we're going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. We're going to close tonight with Jimmy Ruffin, who died recently at the age of 78. He's primarily known for two things. He was the older brother of David Ruffin, who was the lead singer of the Temptations when they did their classic My Girl. And Jimmy Ruffin did a solo record of his own in 1966, which was also a Motown classic. Jimmy Ruffin was born in Collinsville, Mississippi, not too far from the Alabama-Mississippi border near Meridian, and his family made the great migration up to Detroit. In the early 1960s, when Motown was putting together the Temptations, for a little while they were looking at him to be one of their lead singers. Jimmy had a nice smooth voice, but I think ultimately they were looking for something that contrasted a little more with Eddie Kendrick's voice, and so they went with his younger brother David, who had a little bit harsher voice, and it did a little better with some of the songs like My Girl. Of course, they had to put up with David's personality too, which was a little harsher also. Jimmy did okay though as a solo singer with one of the Motown classics. They got the Funk Brothers in the studio in 1966, and he recorded this memorable song.
All is lost, there's no place for beginning. All that's left is an unhappy ending. Now what becomes of the broken hearted who had love that's now departed? I know I've got to find some kind of peace of mind. I'll be searching everywhere just to find someone to care.
Yeah, almost 50 years later, what becomes of the broken heart? It still sounds good. Jimmy was never able to duplicate that success. Motown started changing around 1966, but his follow-up to it, his other hit as it were, was almost as good a song, a little bit of a sound-alike. It's called I've Passed This Way Before. Jimmy Ruffin, I never thought Berry Gordy gave him as much of a chance as he should have, and he could have been a bigger star.
It's so hard to face reality.